So the customer acquisition cost has two main components. It's sales and marketing. Sales basically is every single thing that goes into your sales. Anything and everything to help deliver a client from a sales perspective to your front door. The bottom part is marketing. There's a million different ways in which you can mix those components up. You may label it a little different, but those are the two main components and the subcomponents underneath that eventually make up your customer acquisition cost.
Hello everyone, welcome to Building a Better CAC by Commexis, a podcast dedicated to connecting the space between your revenue goals and sales and marketing initiatives. I'm Matthew McGordy, the social media content producer here at Commexis.
I'm Len Ward, the managing partner at Commexis.
So today we're continuing our look into the 7 questions of the Commexis 3-to-1 and 18 process. As a refresher, these are the questions we ask our would-be clients first before we can truly begin to help them see marketing differently. If you missed the last episode, definitely check it out. We list the 7 questions and discuss the first question, which explains revenue targets and why they are so important and why it is the first question in this order. But enough about that. Today we're focusing on the second question. What is my customer acquisition cost? So Len, first can you answer this for me? What is a customer acquisition cost?
Your customer acquisition cost is basically how much money it costs for you to actually acquire a customer that walks through your front door, signs up for your service or whatever type of product you're selling.
So what normally goes into the customer acquisition cost? I think generally, people hear that, they understand, but I know there's a couple things that some businesses might not think about that go into the CAC.
So the customer acquisition cost has two main components. It's sales and marketing. Sales basically is every single thing that goes into your sales. So you have to think about salary, you have to think about commissions, free demos, free trials. You have to think about labor that may help with the sales. You also want to think about maybe some like sales collateral, entertainment, anything and everything to help deliver a client from a sales perspective to your front door. The bottom part is marketing. Marketing is pretty straightforward on what it sounds like. It's anybody, labor, creative, anything like that that goes in there. Your actual paid media spend on Google, on Facebook, on if you're doing traditional, any type of traditional radio, TV. Then there's an agency component to that. So if you don't have internal labor, or you do have internal labor, but there's another agency helping you out, consulting, you have that. And the last component of that is MarTech, which is marketing technology. So there's a million different ways in which you can mix those components up. You may label it a little different, but those are the two main components and the subcomponents underneath that eventually make up your customer acquisition cost, which again is exactly how much it costs for you to acquire a customer, and knowing that number gets to your ultimate revenue goal.
So historically speaking, do most businesses from your experience know their customer acquisition cost?
No. 98% of companies that I talk to have no idea what their customer acquisition cost is. It's a number that I think companies generally fear. They're afraid of it because the minute you know your customer acquisition cost, you now look at your company in a completely different way, and you realize where the weight is of certain things on what you're investing. And quite honestly, it's almost like a company knowing their margins, their gross margins, and then their net margins. It's a frightening number. So yeah, no, the ones that typically do know it are software as a service companies, certain types of direct-to-consumer, like e-com companies. They're normally very, very good at their customer acquisition costs because they know that. But when you move into a service-based business, attorneys, accountants, and things like that, no, they really don't know what it is.
Is it because it's just, well, on one hand, it sounds like you think that generally businesses are a little afraid of knowing because then they have to do certain actions to fit that. But is there also an element of maybe it's either difficult for them to calculate, or maybe they're just not thinking of all the factors? What kind of goes into that?
I think it's a combination of both. I think it is a very difficult thing to factor in because a lot of times you may say, okay, well, I guess we got to include Mike. Mike's part of the customer acquisition cost because Mike helps the sales team, get the people in the front door, and he gets the lunches together, and we actually sell it. Oh, but by the way, Mike does work on our computers, and Mike's kind of an IT guy, so does it count? So it's kind of like a really bad analogy, but people don't really understand like all the facets that go into the customer acquisition cost. So rather than just saying, okay, well, let's break down how much time Mike actually dedicates to the sales process, then we're going to put his number in there. That's what keeps people saying, you know what, this is just too big of an effort, and we're not going to worry about it. And because you've been sitting on a great economy over the last 12 years, and right now our economy is, so-so. We'll see what happens in the next few months. You really haven't had to do that. If you've done a couple of the right things, you've probably had a better than 60 to 70% chance of succeeding at some capacity. So you really haven't needed to know that number. But now, as things are getting a little more difficult, it's a number you're going to need to know.
Yeah. So one thing we've mentioned in the past in other podcasts, other videos that we've created, are that the revenue target, the CAC, and as we'll get to in the next episode of this podcast, the LTV and the LTVR are sort of a part of your company's financial DNA. So like, why is the CAC so critical to understand?
Well, I mean, I think the customer acquisition cost fuels all the decisions you're going to make. So if we went and said that, we're going for $1 million a year. We're trying to get 10 units sold, which is $100,000 each. And in theory, the right number should be about 30 grand you're investing in that 100 grand. We'll have to get into it. Once you know that number, we're just going to use the number. It cost you $30,000 to acquire a $100,000 product, where you can, your return is profitable and your company's doing well. That makes you think differently. It makes you think differently because it's, okay, am I going to hire this individual in marketing, or am I going to hire this individual in sales? Am I going to let this sales lady contact me and say, okay, I want to try to sell you on a CRM that costs me 20 extra grand, whatever it may be. You're going to start making decisions because you're like, okay, wait, well, if I hire that individual or I buy that CRM, my customer acquisition cost is now $40,000 opposed to $30,000, which means I'm going to lose less money. So it's almost like a salary cap. You have to keep everything at that $30,000 within sales and marketing. And the only way in which you can change those components is that if you're moving another component out, because if you're just adding another component to it, this is where your profitability starts coming down. This is where things like cash flow becomes an issue. This is where you're like, we're just not making our numbers this year becomes an issue. So it truly is the main DNA component of your company, financial DNA, as you just said. And it's a number that really fuels all the decisions you're going to make on sales and marketing. You're not going to say, hey, throw a number at me or give me a proposal. I'm considering it, because the reality of the situation is, you're not. If you're succeeding at $30,000 and you're allocated right and you're making your money, you're going to tread very carefully about hiring a new individual or bringing on a new CRM or whatever it may be.
Yeah, makes sense. Is there anything you want to, before we close out, any final comments?
No, I think the biggest thing with customer acquisition costs is, and I know I keep pounding the table on it, and I'm not the only individual that does this. I know there's a lot of people that, probably the most famous guy that does it is Mark Cuban on Shark Tank. So if anybody's ever watched Shark Tank, that guy pounds the table. What's your customer acquisition cost? And when you don't know it, he gets very frustrated. Your customer acquisition cost is one of the major things that venture capitalists, that investors, that your banks are looking at. Now, we're going to get into the LTVR in a minute, which is a scalable number, but it's critical. And if you can go in and sit down with an investor and discuss your customer acquisition costs and discuss it intelligently and understand it, it's at that point people are more apt to maybe invest in your company. Maybe a business partner comes in and wants to work with you and so forth. It's just, to me, it really is such a critical number that, it's almost like when you're looking at your balance sheet and you're breaking down your numbers, your customer acquisition cost has to live there. You really have to understand on your profit and loss what your customer acquisition cost is within that P&L, because it really does help you make better decisions and actually make much better decisions on digital marketing and so forth.
That's all for today's episode of Building a Better CAC. Check us out on Commexis.com, YouTube, and anywhere you can get your podcasts, and follow us on Twitter @Commexis. Thanks for listening.